Imagine a man is standing in his garage on a Friday night, halfway through an oil change on his truck. Wrench in hand, radio on low, the smell of motor oil and cold concrete in the air, when his phone buzzes on the workbench. It's his buddy Mike. "So you're really not helping me move Saturday?" He wipes his hands, picks the phone up, reads it once, reads it again. And the old version of him, the guy he was even a year ago, would already be typing, already canceling his own plans to make it work, already rehearsing an apology for a no he hadn't even finished feeling guilty about yet. But this version of him sets the phone face down on the bench and goes right back to the wrench. A minute later, it buzzes again. "Guess I thought I could count on you, my bad." He reads that one too. And he doesn't call, doesn't explain himself, doesn't spend the rest of his Friday night drafting the perfect text that'll make Mike feel better about being let down. He finishes the oil change, wipes his hands on the rag hanging off his belt, goes back inside for dinner like it's any other Friday. And that right there, that small, boring, completely unremarkable refusal to manage another man's disappointment, that's the whole video, because what you just watched wasn't a guy being a bad friend. That was the birth of something. Why does a grown man calmly finishing an oil change while his buddy sits there disappointed feel like it's breaking some kind of code? Why does it feel almost wrong to watch? Because it is breaking a code, an old one most men agreed to before they were even old enough to understand what they were signing. And if any part of that garage scene made something in your chest tighten, that's not you watching a stranger, that's recognition. Some part of you is already becoming him, slowly, unevenly, maybe without a name for it yet. This isn't a story about someone else. It's a status update on where you already are. The lie society sells you about loyalty. Let's talk about the lie because it's been sold to men for so long it doesn't even sound like a lie anymore. It sounds like character. A good man shows up no matter what it costs him. Real men make sacrifices. Somewhere along the way, sacrifice quietly got redefined. From something you choose to give, into something you're required to hand over the second somebody else expects it. You were taught that your worth as a man gets measured in reliability. How fast you answer the call, how rarely you say no, how much you'll absorb before you finally push back. And that sounds noble right up until you notice who benefits most from you never learning to say no. It's rarely the guy actually doing the moving on Saturday who's giving the lecture about being a team player. It's everyone standing around watching. Funny how that works. Think about the specific language too, because it's doing a lot of quiet work. Don't leave me hanging. I really thought I could count on you. Everyone else made it work. None of these are actual arguments. None of them explain why your Saturday belongs to somebody else by default. They're not persuasion. They're pressure dressed up as disappointment. And they work exactly because you were trained since you were a kid to treat somebody else's letdown as an emergency you're personally responsible for solving. A people-pleasing man terrified of disappointing anyone is remarkably easy to run. You don't even need leverage on him. You just need to look a little let down, and he'll rearrange his whole life to fix your face. Notice, too, how selective this rule always turns out to be. The same guy lecturing you about loyalty has probably cancelled on you twice this year without a second thought, and it never occurred to him to feel guilty about it, because guilt was never actually the universal rule everyone claimed it was. It was a rule that got applied to you. That's not community. That's a one-way toll booth with your name on it. The ancient men who figured this out first. Here's where it gets interesting. Because this isn't just a modern complaint about guilt tripping. Men have been quietly wrestling with this for thousands of years, and some of the sharpest minds in history left behind exactly how they did it. I've read somewhere that Marcus Aurelius, and remember, this is a man who ran an empire that stretched across 3 continents, a man who could have anything, command anyone, silence any critic with a single word, still spent nearly every night alone with a notebook, writing to himself, asking himself which of his actions that day had actually come from his own values, and which ones had just been him trying to keep somebody happy. Let that sink in for a second. The single most powerful man in the ancient world was still fighting the exact same instinct you fight every time a buddy looks at you sideways for saying no to Saturday. I've also read that he used to remind himself in those private notebooks that other people's opinions of him weren't actually his to manage, that a man could only ever be responsible for whether his own actions were right, not for how somebody else chose to feel about them. He wasn't writing that down because it came naturally to him. He was writing it down because he had to fight for it, the same as anyone. And then there's Diogenes. I've come across this story enough times, from enough different sources, that I'm fairly confident it's at least close to true, even if a couple thousand years of retelling has polished the edges. As the story goes, Alexander the Great, the most feared conqueror the ancient world had ever produced, a man an entire continent was terrified of disappointing, walked up to Diogenes, who was living in total poverty, and told him he could have absolutely anything he wanted. Anything. And Diogenes reportedly just asked him to step aside, because he was blocking the sunlight. That's it. He didn't flatter him, didn't manage his ego, didn't spend 1 second trying to make the most powerful man alive feel better about being turned down, even though disappointing Alexander could have gotten him killed on the spot. I've also read that Alexander was supposed to have said afterward that if he weren't Alexander, he'd want to be Diogenes, which, if it's even close to true, tells you something. Even the man with the most power on earth recognized that Diogenes had something he didn't. That's what I mean when I say the dangerous man isn't some new internet archetype. He's ancient, he's just rare. Neither of those two men were born like that, by the way. That part matters. Marcus Aurelius had to write himself back into it every single night for years, which means some nights he lost. Diogenes wasn't handed indifference to Alexander at birth. He built it deliberately, choice by choice, in a life most people would have called a failure by every conventional measure. Nobody in this story skipped the part where it's hard. You're not behind them. You're just earlier in the same process they were still working through the night before they died. Why everyone around him needs him to stay reliable. So let's talk about why this terrifies the people around you once you get there. Because there are real specific, traceable reasons here, not vague ones. In families, it's structural. Almost every family quietly assigns somebody the job of showing up no matter what. Fixing what's broken, being the one who can be counted on. And the second that man stops absorbing it, the whole family has to sit in its own dysfunction directly, for maybe the first time in years, and nobody enjoys that. What do you mean the scapegoat scaped? That's exactly why they'll push hardest to get him back into the old role. In friend groups, it's the favor economy. A huge amount of male friendship runs on an unspoken ledger. I helped you move, so you owe me, so don't you dare say no when I call. The second you stop fearing disappointment, you break the entire accounting system, and in the process, you expose every one-sided friendship the group was quietly built on. At work, it's leverage. Plenty of workplaces run on unpaid extra hours, squeezed out of people terrified of being seen as not a team player. And once you're no longer scared of that, you become very expensive to quietly overwork for free, which is exactly why not a team player gets whispered about you the second you start saying no. And psychologically, this one's the quiet one. Other men who are still deep in their own guilt-driven compliance often find it almost unbearable to watch you walk free of it. Not because you did anything to them. Because watching a man walk out of a cage they're still standing in is its own kind of unbearable, and it forces a comparison nobody asked for. There's one more category worth naming, because it doesn't get talked about enough. Reputation management. Somewhere along the way, a lot of men were taught that their whole identity is basically a customer service rating. Friendly, dependable 5 stars would recommend. The second you stop optimizing for that score, people don't just lose a favor. They lose a predictable variable in their life. And predictable variables are comfortable, even when they're quietly draining the person providing them. You becoming unpredictable, even in this small, boring oil change kind of way, is its own kind of threat to a system that ran on knowing exactly what it could get out of you. And there's an economic angle to all of it too, if you're willing to look at it honestly. A guilt-driven man is a reliable customer for the whole apology economy. The last-minute gift to make up for canceling, the extra round he buys to smooth over showing up late, the money spent trying to prove he's still a good guy after saying no once. A man who's stopped fearing disappointment, stops needing to buy his way back into anyone's good graces. And that's a quieter kind of freedom than people give it credit for. He's not performing generosity to offset guilt. When he gives you something now, it's because he wanted to, not because he's paying down a debt he never actually owed. The 4 pillars of the dangerous, unapologetic man. So what actually makes up this kind of dangerous man mechanically, underneath all of it? The version of him you're already partway into becoming. 4 things, and they're not what you'd guess. 1, he still cares. This is the part people miss constantly. And it's the most important one. The dangerous man isn't numb. He's not incapable of empathy. He just no longer lets someone else's temporary feelings override his own decisions in real time. There's a difference between not caring and refusing to let caring run your life for you. And mixing those two up is exactly how people talk themselves out of ever trying this. 2, tolerance. The trained, genuine ability to let another man sit in his own disappointment for a while without racing in to rescue him from it, because rescuing him was never actually the dangerous man's job to begin with. You can practice this the same way you'd practice anything physical. Badly at first, a little better every time you don't cave. 3, internal locus of worth. Somewhere along the way, he quietly moved his sense of value out of other people's approval and put it back in his own hands, where it should have lived the entire time. This is usually the slowest one to build, and it's also the one that makes the other 3 actually stick, instead of just being a temporary phase. 4, the boundary as a complete sentence. Can't make it. Full stop. No defense attorney required. No 3-paragraph explanation, submitted for the jury's approval. Just a sentence and then silence where the apology used to live. And the silence, once you get used to it, stops feeling like a gap you need to fill. The price of becoming him. None of this comes free. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend it does, because that would just be a different kind of lie. Relationships that only worked because you always said yes are going to get strange, or distant, or end outright. And that's going to hurt, even when you know it's fair. You're going to grieve a version of yourself, the reliable one, the guy everyone could count on. Because even when a role is slowly suffocating you, losing it still feels like losing a piece of your own identity. Maybe it's the buddy who slowly stops inviting you to things because you're different now. Maybe it's the family member who brings up every holiday for a year that one time you couldn't make it, like it's evidence in a trial that never actually ends. Maybe it's the version of you that used to get complimented constantly for being so easygoing, and now has to sit with the fact that compliment was never really about you. It was a review of how well you served everyone else's convenience. People are going to call you selfish, different, not who you used to be. Some of them will mean it as a real insult, and some of them will mean it as a genuinely confused kind of hurt. And you have to learn to tell those 2 things apart, because sometimes it does sting even when you're not wrong to have said no. And here's the honest part, the part most videos like this one skip. If you're not careful, if you swing too far in the other direction, this can genuinely calcify into real coldness instead of earned freedom. That's a real risk, not a scare tactic, worth watching yourself for. The paradox nobody warns you about, but here's the paradox. And it's the part that changes everything once you actually sit with it. Once you stop needing to prevent every single disappointment, you end up disappointing far fewer people over the long run. Not more, fewer. Because the people who stick around were never actually there to be managed in the first place. And the relationships that survive are the real ones. That's worth more than being liked by everyone ever was. And the men who do stick around, the ones who actually knew you before any of this, tend to respect you more once you stop performing for them. Not less, because they finally get the real version instead of the customer service one. That's the whole trade. If you want it in one sentence, you lose an audience and you gain actual witnesses. How to actually start building this? If you want to actually start building this instead of just nodding along at your screen, start small, because trying to overhaul your whole personality in a week just turns into another performance. Pick one low-stakes relationship this week and let a small disappointment sit for 24 hours before you rush in to fix it. Don't apologize, don't over-explain. Just let it exist for a day and notice you're still standing. Practice saying no without attaching a justification to it. Just the no, nothing after it. No essay, no evidence for the jury. Notice the exact physical moment your body wants to over-explain itself. That tightening in the chest, the words already forming. And just hold it there for 3 seconds before you decide whether you actually need to say them. And pay attention to who reacts to your first few no's with respect versus who reacts with pressure. because that list is about to tell you more about your relationships than the last 10 years combined. So let's go back to that garage. The oil's already drained. The phone's still face down and dark on the workbench. And the man walking back inside for dinner isn't thinking about Mike's disappointment anymore. Not because he doesn't care, but because he's finally learned the difference between caring about someone and carrying the ungrateful ones. That's not some other guy you're hoping to grow into someday. If you've made it this far, you're not new to this road. You've just been walking it without a name for it. That's the challenge I'm leaving you with tonight. Not to become cold. Not to stop caring what happens to the people in your life, but to keep becoming the dangerous one to the ungrateful who can let them be disappointed in him. Sit with it. Watch them not die from it, and still sleep just fine that night. That's not coldness, that's the dangerous man. And he terrifies people, because he can no longer be managed by a look on someone's face. If this hits somewhere real, share it with the guy in your life who's still playing the reliable one for people who stopped needing him 2 years ago. He might not say thank you right away, and that's fine. This isn't a video that's supposed to feel comfortable on the first watch. And drop a comment for others. What's one relationship in your life right now where you have seen others still performing reliability out of guilt instead of choice? Not the easy answer, the real one. Some people are going to call this selfish. Call it what it actually is. Stay dangerous.